On the developmental phase, when we talk about early emotions, one of the things that many people started talking about is just how emotions are expressed. And that's because, testing emotions, determining which emotions children have, especially young infants, was really difficult for emotional psychologists for a long period of time. Now, we're going to talk about some kind of neat studies that have been done over the years to kind of give us a better sense of some of the early emotions that are out there. And we'll talk again about the basic emotions. But when many people started studying the idea of emotions, one of the things they did was define the two basic, what we would call discrete emotions that really dominate a child's early experiences. Now, there's a belief that we actually experience more than just the two emotions of kind of sadness or anger and happiness, but those are the ones that many people believe really dominate the first year to year and a half of a child's life. And when they study these emotions, one of the things that they do is spend a lot of time studying the manifestation of those emotions. In particular, for sadness, they study crying, and for happiness, they study smiling. And what a lot of researchers have done is actually found ways to separate out the different types of cries and the different types of smiles that children are able to elicit in their early years. One of the more cute and interesting studies that was ever been done over the years, or collections of studies that have ever been done, are ones that allow now researchers and theoretically parents to be able to differentiate between the different types of cries that a children can exhibit and the messages they're trying to convey based on usually the way that they're crying. So a basic cry has a very rhythmic pattern that we've detected, and usually this cry is indicative not of anger, pain, or anything that needs extreme attention right away, but more for a need not being quite met and kind of a need for a parent to attend to those needs. So hunger, exhaustion, and of the willingness or desire to go to bed are all paired up with this basic cry. But when a child starts passing more air through their lungs, when the child starts getting exceptionally upset over something, that's when the tone, the way that cry changes, really kind of tells the parent and the researcher, that something in the environment is actually trained. And another thing that we've detected is what's called the pain cry, and this usually involves a holding of the breath and much louder cry. And not only can parents really detect these differences. If any of you in this class are parents, you probably recognized as you were kind of raising a child what cry they had and what that cry actually meant. And you usually probably were associated with social things. But, as researchers, the fact that we can usually look for hallmarks to crying is really kind of neat and really kind of interesting. And we can use that to detect some of the early emotions that kids have, even though we can't get them to outwardly express through verbal reactions what they're actually experiencing. And the same thing happens for smiling. So we believe that smiling in young infants is as a way that they can usually kind of display content, but being content. But there is a recognition, which is kind of neat, that many early smiles aren't necessarily there for happiness. That they're maybe there just kind of as a survival instinct. We talk about something called a reflective smile, which for those of you that are new parents, you might be not thrilled with me for saying this, but fortunately there's a lot of research to show that many children's early smiles are simply a reflex. They see something that somebody else is displaying, and their mirror neurons, a collection of neurons within their brain, actually trigger the child to smile back reflexively, even though the child has no idea what they're smiling at, has no idea why they're smiling. And in fact, many studies have shown that the child's first smile almost indefinitely, or maybe there might be a few rare cases where this isn't the case, but almost certainly every child's first smile is merely kind of a reflex to somebody smiling at them, or kind of a response to something that's happening within their body. But eventually we know by about 6 months of age, even maybe a little bit younger. In fact, there's studies that have shown that it can even start at about 3 to 4 months of age, if I recall correctly. Many children start displaying what's called a social smile. So recognition of a specific stimulus or kind of induction of some type of environmental factor, it can trigger a child's smile. And when that happens, that's when a happiness is really linked to smiling, and really it's used to kind of encourage environmental factors to continue happening when this social smile starts to pop up. But it's more than just negative and positive emotions that children are feeling, and we'll talk about this in the next slide. As is customarily the case when we talk about emotional development, we usually want to start at infancy. And when we do, what we see is that there's some very basic emotions that children usually experience. What researchers sometimes talk about is the very basic primary emotions of sadness and joy. But most researchers now argue that when we talk about primary emotions, we actually have six primary emotions that children are able to experience before they even learn what these emotions mean. They're just essentially knee-jerk reactions that they're innately capable of displaying. And these six emotions were the ones that we talked about earlier: joy, anger, sadness, fear, surprise, and disgust. And what many developmental researchers have found is that in young children, regardless of their culture, many of them are capable of displaying these six basic emotions within the first few months of life. And the idea here is that these are not things that need to be learned. These are things that are innate within the children, and they allow them to interact with their environment immediately at the moment of birth. But eventually, children need more. One of the first things that starts to pop up is something that we call self-conscious emotions. These are emotions that require the child to understand the sense of self, which we talked about when we looked at Piaget's ideas, and more importantly, they have to understand that there's a social world around them. And when they develop that sense of self-consciousness, there's a belief that some of the major emotions that come up at about this time are empathy, jealousy, embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt. Now, empathy is not necessarily the most common one. Pride is not necessarily really prominent. Shame and same is the same in guilt, but jealousy and embarrassment are two prominent emotions that really pop up in a lot of children between the ages of 1 and 2, and kind of continue throughout the lifespan. And these emotions are believed to be ones that have to actually be learned, and that they're learned through the development of a sense of self and kind of a person's role within the environment. And at about the same time, around 1 to 2 years of age, one of the things that we think is playing a really big role in the development of these emotions is the fact that kids are also developing some sort of an emotional attachment to individuals and to certain things. So if you test young children before the age of 1 with an experiment that you see pictured in the lower right-hand corner, you'll place a parent or a primary caregiver in front of a baby, then have that parent or primary caregiver interact with a fake child or toy. Before about the age of 1, children don't display any sense of jealousy. But as you see there, this child who's about 1 year of age, maybe a little bit older than 1 year of age, is definitely displaying the emotion of jealousy. And that's indicative of him recognizing himself, him recognizing his mother, and him forming an emotional attachment to the mother that's kind of triggering that emotional response within the child. And the belief is that once the child really starts to form attachments, once the child really starts to recognize themselves as a part of their environment, these emotions, these new ones, kind of come flooding in and start to play almost as much of a role as the primary emotions that these children experience at the very beginning of their life. But these are not the only emotions that we're going to develop throughout our life. Now, by the age of 2, children have developed wide ranging capabilities when it comes to emotions in comparison to when they were born. They can experience a litany of extra emotions than they could have when they were younger. They can express them much more easily. But even after the age of 2, many infants are still very stunted in their emotional capabilities, and there's a couple things they really struggle with still after 2 years of developing their emotional skills. One of the things that they really struggle with, even by the age of 2, is finding the ability to express the different emotions that they have. So even though they're developing skills like jealousy or like pride, the facial expressions, the social expressions that we usually link to those emotions are very limited for these young children. And more importantly, their understanding of emotions is very, very small at this point. So they usually cannot necessarily recognize the emotions that they're experiencing. They're just able to actually experience them. They really struggle to recognize emotional capabilities of others, and more importantly, the specific emotions that people are feeling. They have almost no ability to control the emotions that they experience, and because of that, they don't feel any need slash ability to really come up with behaviors that can help regulate their emotions. So when they get sad, they have no soothing technique that they're capable of eliciting to calm themselves and to kind of end that sadness that they're experiencing. And because of that, they really struggle in the social world with respect to emotions. They're there, these emotions are playing a role, but it's not until we get into our childhood that we finally start at least starting to work, or at least start working on this idea of emotions in a much broader way. When children do reach the first couple years of childhood, when we're talking about emotional growth, one of the things that we see that really kicks things off is kids become significantly more complex in the self-conscious emotions that they start to develop. And more importantly, they start to recognize that these emotions just aren't coming out of nowhere. They're recognizing specific situations that are eliciting these emotions. They're recognizing that sometimes the specific emotions aren't necessarily appropriate in those given situations. So what they usually start to do once they recognize that emotions indicate situations indicate specific emotions, and that there's expressions of emotions that they can display. They start to really look in their social world for when emotions are appropriate, which emotions others are feeling when they're in specific situations, and they start using those recognitions of emotions, kind of the emotions in their environment, to really start to work on their emotional capabilities. One of the greatest examples of children really starting to become completely, I guess, aware of their emotions and their emotional abilities was highlighted in a study done by a researcher, a very famous social cognitive researcher named Walter Mischel. And in his study, what he did was test for an ability that he called delay of gratification. In essence, delay of gratification relates to a child slash adult's ability to withstand an immediate reward in order to, I guess, be given a greater reward later on. And in Michel's delay of gratification study, what he did was take young children and present them with a scenario like the one you see pictured in the right hand corner. He'd place them in front of a single marshmallow, and he would tell them, I'm going to leave the room, and if you can resist this marshmallow, this one right in front of you, for a minute, I'm not only going to let you have this marshmallow, but I'll give you an additional one. If you can't resist it, you'll only get this one marshmallow. And what he found in these young children was, as they progressed throughout childhood, a lot of them started to develop the ability to delay gratification. In essence, all of them were having that same experience of emotion. They all wanted it. They all really desired that the marshmallow. Children didn't like the marshmallow. They weren't used in the study. So everyone that was in it, they knew was experiencing the same type of emotion. But as they got older, they started really developing the ability to kind of delay that gratification. But what he also found, which was equally important, was that there were some dramatic individual differences from child to child. So some kids could resist this marshmallow at a very young age. Others, even by the time they were 6 or 7, really struggled to resist that marshmallow. And later studies done by Mischel and some of his former graduate students really showed that ability to regulate their emotions, to recognize the emotions that situation would incur, really predicted very effectively different types of lifestyle and outcomes that they would experience later on. So things like graduation rates, the years when kids would get married, how successful they would be in their careers, the happiness that they had with their peers and family members, could all be predicted by these children's abilities to resist these marshmallows. And these variances really showed that when we're talking about development of emotions in childhood, yes, there's kind of a gradual growth and developmental understanding that happens for all children, but the social environment starts to play a really big role in how well a child develops emotionally at this point in time. So kids that are presented more situations, more information, can develop a greater range of emotions that they experience, a greater ability to recognize the emotions that they're experiencing, and theoretically also start to regulate those emotional expressions that they're trying to regulate in order to maximize their outcomes, to get more of what they want. And when we look at this, we see teaching playing a role, but we also see, stress and environmental factors, major issues that the family is undergoing or something that happens to the child can really stunt emotional growth and emotional development in these young kids. And it can usually have a lasting impact on them, not only in their adolescence, but all the way into their adulthoods. So when we look at a critical age of emotional development, many developmental psychologists think that childhood, especially those early years, 3, 4, 5 years of age, can play a very prominent role in the development of emotional skills later on in life.
Now, after childhood, when we move into adolescence, what we see is kind of a dramatic increase in emotions. And this is primarily based on emotional range, but even the experience of emotions that adolescents tend to have becomes much more dramatic. So when we get into our early teen, late teen years, what we often see is that children or adolescents start to add to their complexity of the emotions that they actually are experiencing. So they can start picking up on different feelings, different mixed emotions that children are incapable of actually feeling, or at least actually recognizing within themselves. In addition, though, to being able to have that complexity, the emotions that adolescents feel tend to be extremely strong. Now, most of us have this misnomer, this idea that a lot of adolescents only feel one particular emotion, and that's negative emotions, anger, sadness. But in actuality, when we look at teenagers, when we look at adolescents, what we see isn't just a strong negative focus, or at least a strong collection of negative emotions, but also a strong collection of extremely positive emotions. And when we look for where this is coming from, what we've actually been able to do is identify two sources of this increase of emotions. One of the increases, or one of the causes to this increase, is actually in the biological makeup of adolescents. At this time, what we see in the brains of adolescents is a huge growth in activity in one particular area that we call the amygdala. It's actually also connected to the hippocampus, which seems to be growing at that time. And the amygdala and the hippocampus, as we've kind of discussed earlier in the biological side, are the two areas that are most closely linked to emotions. And because that area grows especially fast at that age, and unfortunately the area that controls and regulates emotion, our prefrontal cortex, does not, what we see is a real strong experience in emotions that these children, or these adolescents, are having that they weren't capable of having before, and very limited ability to actually control those emotions because of the lack of prefrontal growth in this case. When you pair that with the social factors that adolescents are experiencing, those first dates, those first kisses, those interactions, those growth in sexual desire, and all the other things that pair up with adolescence, we can understand why this is such a turbulent time and such an emotionally ridden time for these individuals. But in addition to just having an increase in emotions, what we also see is that their emotional capabilities do start to increase as well. So they can start to recognize their emotions very well within themselves, really articulate exactly what they're feeling, even if it's a much more blown, or I guess much more extreme way than we would originally think. But they do have the ability to recognize their emotions, and they really do start to recognize emotions in others and can start to make the connections between what's actually causing emotions. Unfortunately, because they're extremely focused on their own emotions, and unfortunately because they don't have the ability to control their emotions very well with their prefrontal cortex, even though they start gaining the skill of recognizing emotions in others and kind of trying to understand what they're feeling, that rush of emotions kind of overwrites a lot of the ability of children to really regulate what they're doing and interact with people, even though they've started to recognize what others are feeling. In addition to this, what they can start to do, though, because they're recognizing their emotions and feeling their own things, is start to predict what social situations might actually do to the emotions of another individual. And that recognition is both a benefit and kind of a cost. So you'll see in adolescents very often them kind of testing the waters or trying to produce specific emotions in others in an attempt to really understand how emotions work, what's going to cause a specific situation, and that toying with social situation is something that's very common. I guess tinkering with social situations is something that's very common in adolescents as they start to explore this topic of emotions.
Now, when we get into adulthood, starting in early adulthood and going actually throughout our entire life, what we see for most people, if you don't have any major health issues or problems, is that we continue to grow in our emotional capabilities throughout our entire lifespan. We talk about this concept, and we mentioned earlier, of something called EQ. We're studying the idea of emotions, the emotional quotient or emotional intelligence that people have. And what we see, which makes this topic somewhat unique from a lot of the other ones, is that as people get older, in comparison to everybody else, their emotional understanding, their recognition of their own emotions, their recognition of the emotions that a specific situation would elicit, really starts to grow. And because of that, what we often see is that people start changing their lifestyle, changing things about their environment that really starts to help their emotional experiences. And in particular, people start to report as they get into their 20s, 30s, and 40s more and more experiences of a positive emotions in terms of the percentage of time that they're experiencing these emotions or the range of emotions that are available, and less experience of negative emotions as they get into their later years. And we think this is primarily due to a lot of the things that these individuals choose to pursue, choose to kind of engage with as they get into their later years, and more options are made available to them. There's a particular theory called the socio-emotional selectivity theory that argues that as people get older, they stop pushing so much for knowledge, stop pushing so much for superiority, and start to think more about ways that they can become emotionally satisfied. So they pursue relationships that are more positive. They spend more time with family members instead of careers, or they do things, whatever they are, to kind of make themselves happier. And by doing that, they do in turn experience better emotions, or at least more positive emotions, fewer negative emotions, and tend to report higher life satisfaction. And this is all related to kind of that increased emotional intelligence, the increased ability to recognize the emotions these individuals are feeling, and kind of the increased ability to regulate their emotional responses so they can maximize their situations that they're encountering throughout the lifespan. So, unlike a lot of the topics we've talked about so far, this is one of those rare instances where we are growing throughout our entire life in emotional abilities. Obviously, if something happens, somebody experiences some type of brain damage, or that their mind starts to decline through something like Alzheimer's, or other things start to happen in their social environment where they start to become extremely ostracized from their family members, or they just kind of get separated, this can obviously have a very negative impact on emotions of individuals. But when we control for those things, when we look at people that continue their life the same way they continued it before, they're just as healthy, there's no major problems in their environment, then usually these individuals do experience this kind of repeated growth, or this continual growth of emotional skills and positive emotional experiences throughout the lifespan. And this theme is not going to be just in emotional ideas. We're going to see this in a lot of the different social concepts that we're going to be talking about in the next few classes.
This marks the end of this first half of the section. In the next section, we're going to be moving on to looking at specific ideas that relate to emotion, so things like temperament and attachment styles. So take a few minutes off here, rest, and we're going to move on to this last half of this class for the week.